Don Falk, Executive Director of TNDC. Thank you for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
The work your team does at TNDC is really inspiring. With thousands of units under management in San Francisco, taking care of your tenants and properties is probably a major undertaking. How do you measure success in your operation?
Thank you for the kind words. We now own and operate over 3,500 homes for low-income San Franciscans with more than 4,000 people living in them. 80% have incomes below $1,000 a month.
Wow.
So TNDC is really working with the most vulnerable people in San Francisco. And we're a kind of a triple line, bottom line business, if you will. So of course, we need to generate revenue and keep our expenses under control, right, such that we can be a viable, sustainable business in the long run. So that's a very important measure, but it can't be the only thing that we're about.
Right.
So we work with our tenants, with the people who live in our housing on a voluntary basis. And so we have a variety of ways of trying to see whether we are being successful with them. And the most important measure of that kind of success is housing retention,
Okay.
which is a nice way of saying helping people avoid eviction.
Right.
And even with affordable housing, because of the low incomes of the people who live in our housing, making rent every month is a challenge for many people. And so we have a social worker in almost each of our buildings. And so the social work staff as well as the property management staff are very attentive to whether people are starting to experience problems that might lead to their being evicted.
Okay. So when it comes to dealing with those sorts of issues, I mean, I deal with that in my business, managing market rate housing, but how do you prevent people from falling short and not being able to pay the rent? How do you offer services, and how long do you let it go before you start making decisions about whether somebody belongs in your properties?
Yes. So of course, like people in market rate housing, we want tenants to be successful in the housing.
Right.
And so there are occasions when it's clear that someone cannot be successful. And in that sense, we want to resolve the situation in a way that is falls shy of literal eviction, because that's so damaging to somebody's future life prospects and their ability to get housed. So that's really the extreme case.
Okay.
We really don't wait, if you will. So at the same time that a property manager may deliver a 3-day notice to a tenant, that a copy of that notice goes to the social worker.
Right.
And so the social worker can reach out to the tenant, it's still voluntary, and say, hey, I'm here if you are having issues.
Right.
And hopefully there is a pre-existing relationship between the tenants and the social worker. And at that point, they can try to unpack what are the underlying causes that might be creating problems, try to understand whether they're short-term or whether they're long-term.
Right.
I imagine, not unlike market rate housing, we can work out payment plans as long as we believe that there's a light at the end of the tunnel. We can assist tenants. There may be an outside issue that is creating problems, whether it's market rate housing or even in affordable housing like TNDC owns and manages. The property management staff don't really have the time or even necessarily the skills to dig into helping tenants solve those kinds of problems.
Right.
But that's what our social workers are trained in. So that enables us to have the bandwidth to really work with people if there is an underlying cause that's getting in the way of paying the rent.
Right. So that ongoing discourse and conversation about what are the underlying causes is what helps you to avoid a nasty eviction, and damaging for everybody involved. And so you can negotiate for the best outcome for everybody. And I think that's one of the most interesting things about the contrast between operating market rate housing and the kind of low income and supportive housing that you offer is that extra layer of social worker support. Tell me a little bit about your staffing in that regard. I mean, you must have the proper number of property managers, but how many social workers are in a building like this one? Franciscan Towers has 105 units.
Yeah, we typically would have one social worker. A bigger building might have two.
Okay.
And we have a saying around here: services are voluntary, and that's very important. This is independent living. We're the landlord. Tenants have a lease. They have rights to their units.
Mm-hmm.
It really is very important to understand this relationship of rights and responsibilities. It's not a program. If somebody doesn't avail themselves of services, that doesn't subject them to eviction.
Right.
So we like to say services are voluntary for the tenants, but not voluntary for the staff.
Right.
In other words, social workers' jobs are to engage tenants and to build relationships such that people want to engage in services. And the social worker and the property management staff form a team.
Right.
And they are in charge of managing or governing the health of the community here. So they will meet once a week in order to talk about whether it's individual tenants or the operation of the buildings, or to plan events or what have you.
That's excellent. It's always a part of the deliberative process when people are having trouble, and to know that those services exist. And I'm sure that the social workers have good relationships with a lot of the people.
And I will say 99% of TNDC's tenants will retain their housing in any given year. So we're very proud that we are, and we do that not because we have relatively higher income among the affordable realm of tenants. We're still serving extremely low-income people. And people understand if one is running short on money, even in that situation, rent is the first thing to be paid.
Right. And to engage in that conversation instead of avoiding it, which tends to be one of the biggest challenges that I have without that level of social work and care and concern, is that sometimes people run from their problems as opposed to facing them and talking about it. And they assume that the only option is to be evicted, as opposed to working out a payment plan or doing something reasonable, because that's what's best for everybody. As a independent, operator of buildings, you must have a tremendous demand for your units. What does the process of bringing new people in look like for you?
Yeah, so, and the demand here, I mean, it's just sad. It's tragic. So we opened up a senior building last summer. 98 units, 100 units available, 6,000 applicants.
I would imagine.
And the thing the worst thing about that is that doesn't even raise eyebrows anymore. Right? No. That's typical. We see more than that when we see properties in San Francisco opening. So there is an overwhelming demand, and it becomes like the lottery, which is really unfortunate. Well, in some ways it is literally a lottery, and that's a matter of fairness and equity and not playing favorite. But in terms of the lottery and winning, it's almost like winning the California lottery. Housing is so expensive and it's so important. So for us, we are a highly regulated industry, which I can talk more about a little bit later. And so we, when we submit marketing plans to our primary regulator, City and County of San Francisco Mayor's Office of Housing, and they will approve it. And they will look at it, very, very carefully to assure that we're complying with their housing laws, and that really everybody has a fair shot. We typically will hold a waiting list open at least 2 weeks, if not 4 weeks. We will get hundreds, if not thousands, of applicants.
Of course.
We will do a lottery in order to place them in order, and then as vacancies arise, we will approach people in the order in which they were drawn. And as I say, it's just sad because the overwhelming majority of people who seek housing with us end up on waiting lists and probably never get called.
Do you pre-qualify people when they come forward, or do you qualify them after there's a space available for them?
We qualify them only afterwards, knowing that 90, if not 99% of people will never get there. We're trying to remove barriers
Right.
to make it as easy as possible to apply. And it's interesting, the city is moving forward and has made real progress in the last 5 years, trying to create a centralized database and process of all the affordable housing in the city.
Right.
And we're not there yet collectively, but it's getting there. Dahlia, it's its name.
Okay.
And
Yeah, I think I've heard about
access to
that, yeah.
housing. I'm not sure what the acronym
Yeah.
stands for, but it's all in the name of trying to make it easier for people to apply. I'll tell you a little story. Many years ago, say 10 years ago, we would announce that we're taking applications and that people should come and show up,
Right.
to get their application and apply.
Right.
Well, it turns out that that's really unfair
Right.
because people would come at 2 a.m. in order to be first in line, and now people with disabilities who can't have don't have the stamina or the ability to do that, it was unfairly discriminating against them.
Right.
So there's just a lot of attention paid because housing is such a precious
Fundamental
resource,
yeah.
especially in San Francisco.
Yeah, definitely. What would you say is the biggest misconception people have about low-income and supportive housing in the Tenderloin?
You know, what I think it is the tendency to pathologize Tenderloin residents.
Yeah.
Because what we tend to read about or what we tend to see if we're walking on the streets may be people who have issues of one kind or another.
Right.
And it is a very, very diverse community. And not understanding and really taking in the depth and breadth of that diversity, which goes way beyond ethnicity or immigration status.
Right.
There are all kinds of people, incredible people, who live in the Tenderloin. So, for example, many people don't know 600 artists live in the Tenderloin.
Okay.
And so that is just one example of the variety of kinds of people who reside here. It is, some people would have characterized it in my awareness as a front door and a back door.
Right.
Front door, it's where people arriving in San Francisco, immigrants, it's for 100 years has been a point of entry for people.
Right.
And a back door, lots of elderly people come here, age in place, and pass away, ending their lives in Tenderloin housing. And in between is a whole vast array of people that, in a way, we don't see them because that 3,000 children live in the Tenderloin.
Right.
One wouldn't know that just by walking down the street.
You don't see that many kids hanging out in the neighborhood. It's not that kind of a neighborhood anymore.
No, and it's fun because come here at 7 a.m. or 7:30 a.m., we see parents walking their kids
to school,
or to the bus stop or to the public transit or what have you.
Right. What kind of advice would you give San Francisco property managers who are operating market rate housing based on your experience operating low-income housing in San Francisco?
Yeah, it's a really good question. There are just some great people here who own and manage housing. There are a few who we wish would manage or operate differently.
Right.
And who's to say what are the circumstances behind it?
Right.
Maybe somebody paid too much for their property and now can't collect enough rent in order to maintain a property properly or in order to provide a really secure place. I think the things that we pay most attention to and hope for is that people are really responsible owners and managers, which most are. We want to see people contributing to the community, not caring only about what happens inside their properties or on the streets in front, but kind of throughout the community. Some of the other things that come to mind for me, for us, displacement, of course, is a major issue. And displacement can mean a couple of things. The stuff we might read about in the headlines are Ellis Act, which of course is the law and is, permitted and so forth. It's something we don't like to see.
Right.
And yet there's nothing immoral about it per se. We really do not want to see people evicted for that reason, or evicted for any unjust reason. So there's a real strong ethic here around wanting to see property managers help people retain their housing, even when they're charging a market rate. There's another issue that I'll just surface that's, it's controversial among some, and because there really are multiple points of view that have validity. And it's displacement not as the eviction or the Ellis Act, but as something that happens over time that is better understood as outmigration,
Mm-hmm.
meaning that as people vacate their units, the next household moving in is much more affluent,
Right.
because the rent-controlled unit now can be rented for a lot higher
Right.
rent. So people in the Tenderloin are looking and saying, well, 10 years from now, is this still going to be predominantly a low-income neighborhood? And even more so, will low-income people be welcome here?
Right.
And so that brings me to sort of the third thing on my mind about how I am thinking about market rate housing owners and managers, and that is that we want the Tenderloin to remain a place where low-income people are welcome, even as businesses and owners and managers may start catering to a higher income population with a somewhat different demographic
Mm-hmm.
of the people who have lived here historically. And so kind of the classic vision of this is the $4 coffee place,
Right.
which Tenderloin residents really cannot afford.
Right.
Or even beyond that, just this feeling of being welcome, our low-income people welcome here, and over time, will there come to be a feeling of, gosh, the traditional Tenderloin resident is devaluing my property, and I really wish we would clean up the Tenderloin.
Right.
That's the kind of attitude that we hope market rate managers and owners don't bring, and very, very few do. It really is a community, and I don't see or perceive the divisiveness that sometimes can exist among the affordable or market rate owners and managers.
Okay.
I see lots and lots of people really contributing to this same long-term goal of being a healthy community,
Right.
with low-income people living there, but not only low-income people.
Right.
So I'm not sure if I'm being responsive to your question
I
or
think
not.
definitely. I mean, as a follow-up, what kind of things do you see that market rate owners operating buildings in the Tenderloin can do to contribute to the community in a way that's helpful for you?
Well, one is to think about who is leasing the ground floor commercial space, and what kind of services they're offering, and at what price point.
Right.
And there is value in catering to tourists or catering to people from outside the Tenderloin, because it brings disposable income into the Tenderloin, if you will.
Right.
But maybe who's being employed there?
Right.
And are those businesses employing Tenderloin residents? And can we offer uses on the ground floor that will cater to Tenderloin residents,
Right.
even given that people don't have a lot of money? One of the things about, and one of the dynamics in the Tenderloin is that, yes, it is a low-income neighborhood, and the individuals or the households here tend to have very low incomes. But because it's so dense, in aggregate, there's a fairly substantial purchasing power.
Right. A lot of small transactions add up.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely.
That's an interesting point. Not something I'd thought of. If you don't lease to the $4 coffee shop, maybe there are more opportunities to foster that level of community.
Yeah. And I'll add another example, just trying to think about how can managers, owners, lessees, how can people become part of the community? And I'm just reminded of one of TNDC owns, I want to say 40 commercial spaces. So we do a fair amount of commercial leasing.
Yeah.
One of our commercial tenants, he takes credit. He has relationships with people such that he knows that when it gets near the end of the month, people are stressed financially.
Right.
So he will sell to them, and come the first of the month,
he'll get his payment.
He'll get his payment. He kind of keeps an informal tab, and people love him for that.
Right.
And so
that's such a throwback, old-fashioned concept. I haven't heard of that in a long, long time.
Yes, and in some ways, to me, it bespeaks the community that the Tenderloin really is. And for a long time, I've had this feeling that lots of people drive through the Tenderloin,
Roll
roll
up
up the windows, lock the doors,
Right.
that kind of thing, and don't understand that it is genuinely a community. In some ways, more than the kind of middle class place that I live, where
Right.
I may or may not know my neighbors or see them every day or what have you.
Right.
People here really know one another.
Yeah. Well, that's really interesting. Now, you mentioned outmigration as it seems to me like a standard outcome from rent control, where the next generation of tenant is going to be at a much higher market rent, and that is a driver of change. What are some of the effects that you see? I mean, rent control is the rules of the road here,
Yes.
but how does it factor into your work here in the neighborhood?
Yes. So it's a little bit technical, although it's actually not hard to understand. The way San Francisco's rent stabilization ordinance reads and works is that properties are subject to rent control built before 1979,
Right.
unless they are regulated by another government entity.
Okay.
And so, because of all of TNDC's properties are financed by the Mayor's Office of Housing and Community Development
Right.
of the City and County of San Francisco,
Right.
we're regulated rather than by the Rent Board, by the Mayor's Office of Housing.
Okay.
And so MO8CD and their documents are the ones who govern not just our rent, but really all the ways in which we operate.
I see.
And every building, like the Franciscan Towers that we develop, we're signing 150-page loan agreements
Right.
with lots and lots of guidelines, regulations, requirements, reporting requirements. We're
Okay.
inspected, we're audited, all that kind of stuff.
Okay.
So there is a way in which there's a rent control-like mechanism
Right.
that we are subject to.
So how I would imagine, are there price protections that are involved with that, just like rent control, or is it?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So the mechanism is a little different. Like
Okay.
rent control, there's a formula, and the rent board approves once a year
Right.
whether they're going to adjust to that formula or not, and this is the citywide increase. For affordable housing, it's a little bit more of a building by building thing.
Okay.
So on the one hand, when we first develop a building, there's a maximum income that an occupant can have, right? So
Right.
everyone has to be below that income level. And we also set rents, and when those rents are initially set, the city approves them. And lots of other people actually have a say as
Okay.
well. The investors, the lender, get to review our financing, and everyone
Right.
agrees this is the rent. And then from year to year, our rent increases are governed by changes in median income.
Okay.
And
All right.
if we want to deviate from that,
Right.
we will need to ask for permission. Now that sets the maximum increase. At TNDC, and it does, and again, I hope it doesn't too technical, but it's
No.
very a profound thing.
Yeah.
In the marketplace, and so notwithstanding rent control, rents are a function of the market.
Right.
So
Demand and
right,
how many people
supply
are
and
coming
demand,
here.
exactly. And so in someone moves out of a rent control unit, what does the rent go to? The rent floats to the market. That's capitalism. That's our real estate system.
Right.
A group like TNDC, we're out of the marketplace
Right.
in a way.
Right.
And so the way that we think about rents,
Right.
we don't charge what the market will bear. And of course, we couldn't, right?
Right. You're not allowed.
We're not allowed.
Yeah.
Right. What we think about is how much money do we need in order to operate the property?
Right.
And so our rent increases are a function of our operating cost increases.
Right.
And as a result, to the extent we can keep our operating costs down, we can keep our rents down. We can still collect all the money we need
Mm-hmm.
because there's no one we need to deliver a return on equity to.
Right.
Right? There's no earnings per share. There's no stock market trading, any of that kind of stuff. It's all about internally covering our costs and putting enough money into reserves in order to replace reserves in order to finance big projects.
Renovations and
over the
upgrades
course
and
of time.
safety improvements and things like
Yeah.
that.
So that enables us once a year to look and see, okay, what's next year's budget? How much
Right.
of our costs gone up? And basically, what's the lowest rent increase we can tolerate and still meet our budget?
Right.
And by doing that, we can hopefully serve a lower income population by
Right.
keeping our rents down, which really goes to one of your initial questions, right? How does managing property, affordable property, differ from market rate property? If one can just imagine over the course of time,
Right.
right, over 20 years,
Right.
the market rate housing rent increases, what, average? 3%, 2% a year?
Yeah.
So maybe in affordable housing, for us, our cost increases are maybe, well, I wish they were 1%, but
Right.
they're probably higher than that. Say they're 1.5%.
Right.
Say they're 2% compared to maybe 3% in market rate housing. The point I'm trying to drive at is that over the course of 20 years,
Right.
the delta between what's happening in the market rate housing
Right.
and affordable housing, we can be affordable even without subsidies. Over the course of time, there can be a very substantial difference between what we charge and what gets charged in the market.
Right. Well, the arrangement that you have allows you to see the entire property as an entity as opposed to
Yes.
individual units,
Yes.
and take a 20 or 30-year
yes.
horizon on
Yes.
that investment, so that you can cover those expenses and not run short, which is really the most important thing in any housing.
Yes.
But you're not striving for the same, gee, I want as much profit as I can get so that I can put it in my pocket at the end of the day. It's how can you maintain that property for the people who live there as the main focus.
It is right on point, and it highlights another big difference between affordable developers like TNDC and most market rate developers, and that is we are forever owners.
Right.
And
Right.
we really, and that changes the decision-making calculus
Sure.
on a lot of things. We also are challenged often to recapitalize our properties
Right.
in 15 or 20 years.
Right.
So we don't think about the 7 to 10, maybe 15-year time horizon, in which case we can package for sale, recapitalize, return,
Right.
to the investors their capitalization event with the
Yeah.
right equity
Yeah.
event.
Refinance and
Yeah,
take
yeah.
cash out.
Yeah, exactly. So
Right.
for us, sometimes there might be that opportunity, but mostly we have to think about, okay, how are we going to take care of this building for 35 years without that kind of an opportunity?
Yeah.
And at some level, we can't.
Right.
And we just know that we're going to have to go back to the city in 15 or 20 years and look for a deferred loan in
Right.
order to undertake these major capital improvements. And what the city gets in return for that, we sign up for another 55 years of affordability.
Affordability, exactly. So I guess your source of financing is city funds, and your role is to operate these projects for the city as a public benefit, which it sounds like that's a reasonably good, a partnership between
Yes.
a private corporation
Exactly.
and the city, that for better or for worse, we see what has happened in some of the city-run housing, and it doesn't look anything like this. This is really tremendously nice facility. It feels like a home.
Nonprofit, and this is a nationwide phenomenon, have really demonstrated their ability to
Right.
manage property. I mean, here we are. We are in the middle of the Tenderloin, and when our tenants don't like what we're doing,
Right.
they walk next door and they tell us so.
Yeah.
And so
Because your office is right there.
we're right there, so there's a real level of accountability. This idea of the accountability between us and the city is very profound because they lend us money. It's not a grant.
Right.
And what that means is there's a loan, there's a deed of trust, and if we misbehave either don't manage it well,
Right.
charge too much rent, or rent to high-income people, those are the three basic tenants.
Violations that
Right,
you
exactly.
could have.
They can foreclose.
Yeah.
Right? And so, and then the other thing I'd add is that the city is part and parcel of every project. They are the first money in.
Right.
Their money is essential to making any of our affordable housing work. And we then build a capital stack of 6 or 8 other groups. It's so complicated.
I
It's
bet.
just heartbreaking how difficult it is to
Yeah.
manage. The city, the Mayor's Office of Housing, they are at the core of it all.
Right.
And from that we build with So we're privately financed as well.
Right.
Bank of America, Chase, Wells, Citi, they're all, and many others, they're all in our projects. We have investors, so
Mhm.
investors who are getting return through the low-income housing tax credit.
Hmm.
It's a kind of insane system,
Right.
and there you are. We work with what we're handed.
Well, that makes you unique that you're able to juggle all of that because it sounds tremendously complicated.
My former board president, TNDC's former board president, once said, it's just a really pithy little saying, affordable developers are to market rate developers as Ginger Rogers was
Right,
to Fred Astaire's. We
right.
do everything they do, but
Backwards and in heels. Yeah, I've heard that. That sounds like an excellent
Yes,
description of
analogy.
exactly how
That's
that
true.
would be. It seems complicated to do the market rate housing, but to do it with all of those restrictions and all of those different partners and to keep everybody in line and going in the same direction is, I mean, sounds tremendously complicated.
And yeah, it is, and it has its costs. It can be inefficient, and it's not that nonprofit developers are inefficient. It's that the demands of public money,
Right.
which requires a lot of scrutiny, is it can be very time consuming.
It sounds like it. When I think about purchasing buildings, I think about numbers like the cap rate and NOI. What are the kinds of numbers that drive your decision about whether a specific building is worth buying a good investment?
Yeah, and it's just a great example because the financial dynamics, they're just in a whole different box.
Right.
We never have to calculate that.
No.
Instead, what we look at kind of in a bottom line kind of way, is what is the city subsidy per unit.
Right.
Because the city has a certain amount of money, they want to develop as much housing as they can.
Right.
And so for projects to be successful, what they want to fund projects that will enable them to build as many homes as they can. Now that oversimplifies it.
Mm-hmm.
So just to take it to the one next level of complexity would be to say that the city, or really any public funder, will also take into account the affordability level that we're proposing.
Right.
So if we're proposing deeper affordability, lower rents, lower income people, they will be willing to calibrate upwards the amount that they'll put in per unit.
Right.
Or the other way around, if we're serving people at the higher end of affordability, they will expect to invest less money because they'll expect us to leverage more.
Right. Right. So the highest demand is for the lowest income groups based on the fact that their ability to pay is so much less.
And the city will commensurately be willing to invest more money per unit. So that's a real fundamental cost dynamic. And then we're looking strategically. And so part of it has to do with where is the housing located.
Right.
And I don't mean simply, for example, we love corner properties. I imagine market rate property owners do, right?
Yeah.
Because one gets natural light from two sides. One can kind of have a community development impact down two different streets. So that, but also what neighborhood is it in? And so there's, in a way, almost a political element of wanting affordable housing throughout the city and not wanting it all in one place, all in the Tenderloin, or all in what have you, South of Market. So there's that thought of geographic equity or geographic distribution. There's some thought about like who are we building for? Not just income level, but families, seniors, people coming out of homelessness, youth. So all those things might play into this question of, is this a site that we're interested in? Mm-hmm. And then the last thing I'll add, and this is what I would imagine is a similarity between affordable developers and market rate developers, scale really matters. Right. And so the power of economies of scale, it's almost like gravity. It's just one of those things that is a fundamental law of nature.
Yeah, definitely. Well, as I was looking at the portfolio on your website, it's interesting to see the number of buildings that you took over that seem to already have the population you were serving residing there, and contrasting that with ground up development. But in a lot of circumstances, it seems like older buildings need major renovations when you take over. What are some of the challenges that you see in performing those renovations while the buildings remain occupied?
Occupied rehabs are so difficult for the tenants,
Right.
for the contractor, for the architect, for the staff.
Right.
Everybody hates them for good reason. Of
Right.
course, when the building is done,
Everybody
loves it. Right.
Yeah.
So that is the thing that keeps us going, if you will.
Yeah.
We have 3 full-time relocation specialists on our staff.
Oh, okay.
Because we're doing so many of these occupied rehabs.
Okay.
And what would be typical, and one can just, it's intuitive, imagine it. We're vacating a floor, or
Right.
sometimes vacating a stack,
Right.
right, because of the plumbing.
And
right,
all that
exactly.
commonality.
And so there is the stress and difficulty, first being sure there are enough vacancies before we start construction.
Right.
So
right.
we vacate by attrition, never, or in some cases might temporarily relocate.
Helping them out,
Yes.
making sure that it's
Yes.
as low impact as possible.
Exactly. Letting them know they have a right to return,
Right.
and really reassuring them you will be able to move back if you want to.
Right.
And then all the planning involved with the contractor of getting unit ready, moving somebody out, working on the floor, having creating a path of travel with minimal impact, dust, noise,
Right.
when does work begin, having almost an ombudsperson because
Someone
issues,
to talk to.
right?
Yeah.
It's inevitable that problems will occur. Trying to communicate, and over communicate so that every week, hey, here's the work that's taking place this week. So it's a very, very involved process. And even with all of that, it's just hard on people. It's just
Yeah.
really, really hard on people.
Do you feel like when you go into an in-place redevelopment like that, that you get benefit of the doubt from the residents based on who you are and the fact that you're not a for-profit developer?
No.
No?
I think people are people, and I may be too overly tuned in. Like
Yeah.
in my role, I
Yeah.
hear mostly complaints.
Of course, that's your job.
So I might have a biased view of what people think. I think there's a little bit of a prove it to me, and I
Right.
think that I don't think we have a halo over our heads.
Huh.
Right? We do things wrong. We're the man. We're a big institution. We're a bureaucracy. We do things wrong. And I don't assume that just because we're not profit motivated, that we're better than market rate developers at taking care of tenants. Like we have rights, we have responsibilities, just like market rate owners do.
Right.
And
Right. The business is the same no matter
the business
which end
is the
you're
same.
on.
Yeah, and at some level, once you take out the rent,
Yeah.
we're landlords.
Yeah.
We and even to maybe put it more positively, right? Market rate developers, owners, managers, every bit as humane. They care about their tenants just like we care about our tenants.
Right.
So I don't want to think too highly of us, if you will.
Okay. Well, I find that surprising in that I think that in my business, I feel like a lot of times tenants immediately assume that the landlord's main role is to displace them, to get them out of the building. And in your circumstance, if you're asking somebody to relocate for a little while and offering them support with that,
Yes.
it's probably very inconvenient and it's probably very unpleasant.
Yes.
But at the same time, there's got to be some level of underlying trust that says,
Yes.
when I say, when your property manager says you get to come back, you have a
Yes.
right to occupy.
Yes.
That really means that, because why would we ask you to leave and put somebody else
Yes.
in exactly your situation back
Yes.
into that unit if we could just have you back in that unit?
So I think my thought is really we have to prove it just like
Anybody else.
So on day one,
Right.
people are. I don't want to overgeneralize,
Sure.
but some will I'm listening, but you're going to have to show me.
I'm skeptical.
And we spend a lot of time of communicating and reassuring people. We, talk to your friends, talk to others who've been in the situation. Here's the document. You can read the document for yourself. You have a right to return. And we really hope that we do demonstrate so that by the end, people really do trust and really do believe that in the overwhelming majority of cases, they're treated well and we're good to our word.
Yeah. Now, as I was thinking about the business of operating, low income and supportive housing, it struck me there were two main focuses that I think that could be taken. One of taking the most vulnerable people and preventing them from slipping into homelessness, and the other of offering support so that they don't need low income supportive housing, that they can be more successful. Which one of those do you think is do you have a greater focus on either one of those approaches, or is it a mix?
I think the principle that governs the work of my coworkers around this would be to meet tenants where they are.
Okay.
And so we're trying to listen and to understand what are people's aspirations. What do they dream for? What is a good quality of life? What is the issue that they want to address?
Mm-hmm.
And then do our best, whether it's through our own services or the way that we're interacting with them, or by helping them identify other services in the community. So if someone comes in and what they want is part-time employment or full-time employment, then we're trying to find the employment agency who can deliver and offer that. If what they want is to be reunited with their kids, which may be something that happens in our family housing.
Mm-hmm.
If someone has an issue with the use of substances,
Right.
then we may try to help them understand how best to address that and connect them to the services where they can do that. At some level, what we would like to see happening is each tenant who comes voluntarily and develops a trusting relationship with a social worker, developing an individualized plan, and then having the social worker not do it for them, but support them in their own journey.
Okay. So would you say that you have a majority of residents who stay for a long term, or is there a level of turnover that people no longer need this kind of housing, and they move on to market rate housing somewhere else, or reconnect with family and things like that?
Yeah. So I want to offer a couple of answers to that. One is that in San Francisco, sadly, most people who move out of affordable housing are also moving out of San Francisco.
Right.
And so that really, really impacts the velocity of moving.
Right.
I would also say in TNDC's own particular case, because we're serving such a low-income population, most people are not upwardly mobile. I would say, almost half of our residents are elderly. And so most will probably age in place and pass away in their Tenderloin housing. But I don't want to paint with one brush, right? It is such a diverse group. There certainly are people on the one hand who will get to the point where they can generate savings and become first-time home buyers somewhere else in the Bay Area or outside the Bay Area. Likewise, there might very well even be people who entered TNDC housing having experienced homelessness and be in supportive housing with the benefit of services, and over the course of time get to the point where they don't need services, need quote-unquote, or wouldn't benefit so much from having services. And maybe in those situations they would move to other affordable housing in San Francisco where they can afford a higher rent but no longer be in an SRO, single room occupancy residential top room, maybe move to a studio, or conceivably, it's very hard for me to imagine people moving out of affordable housing into market rate housing in San Francisco. But there is this idea of progressing out of homeless housing into, I'll call it non-supportive housing, but still affordable, thereby opening up a unit for someone else on the streets. I think it's a very, very small minority where one can make that happen. On the other hand, thinking from a systems standpoint, one can imagine that that is more efficient, makes better use of resources than building another homeless unit.
Right. Well, in wrapping up, thank you for your time today. I had one final question, just in terms, sort of like a job interview question. Where do you see TNDC in 10, 20 years? How much affordable housing do you think is enough in a place like San Francisco?
You know, I think San Francisco ought to have a third of its housing stock be for low-income people,
Wow.
and that is that's city policy. 2 years ago, there was a proposition put before the voters, sponsored basically by the mayor and Supervisor Kim, and that was the outcome. So I think that makes for a worthy policy goal. We're a little shy of that right now as a city, and I think, especially as more and more market rate housing gets built, which I really support, we also need to be building affordable housing at that kind of 1/3, 2/3 pace. The role TNDC plays in that, you know, I feel like we are one of the few groups that really is successfully and efficiently and effectively building, managing, owning, providing services in affordable housing. And so I want us to play a role in it. I think as we do more of it, we'll get better and better. We'll become a more and more sustainable organization because we're still a nonprofit. We still are raising $2.5, $3 million a year through philanthropy.
Wow.
And so in order to do what we do, we need to raise money. And who knows, maybe someday we would reach a scale where we would not have to do that and we can do everything we do without needing philanthropy. So it's a really important question. And for me, I can really envision TNDC being a group. You know, right now we do more than just housing. We have, you know, programs for young people. We do community organizing. We do a lot of stuff in food. And I really think that we could branch out and do so much more if we could build the stronger financial base that really comes from owning, managing property.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
I appreciate it.
Yeah,
Fantastic.
Thank you for the opportunity to talk. Thank you.